Hey everybody, it's Frankie-Lou. I'm coming to you today from the kitchen of the Grow Together homestead, where I wanted to talk about raised bed garden planting. Now, I would have preferred to do this outside today so I could demo some of these concepts, but it's so windy here today that there's absolutely no chance I would be heard. So I apologize, we're doing it from the kitchen, but I can show you a couple things that might help you out. The reason why I'm doing this now is it's too early for us here in southern Alberta and in a lot of the more cooler climates to even be thinking about getting started on planting. But what a lot of us are doing right now is planning for gardens. I know this because it seems like I've been talking to so many people about it lately and helping others sort out their gardens and plan it. So I thought, why not create a video where I run down a couple of the key ideas that I go over and over and over again with my family and friends who I help to create gardens with, to set you up for success with your raised bed garden. Now, first off, your first question might be, why would I do raised bed? You may not need to do that where you are. You may have plenty of space, or you may have perfect soil and ideal conditions. But that's not the case with what I'm dealing with here. I have a nice little acreage outside of Calgary where it's zone 3, heavy winds, drought conditions, crazy animal life, and I need to do everything I can to create a good nourished soil. It's hard for us to maintain a good nourished soil here without tons and tons and tons of amendments because there's so much clay and, like I said, drought conditions. So I just find that with the raised beds, it really, really does help me to keep a healthy garden producing every year and nice nourished soil without a ton of work and cost in terms of amendments. Another reason why I really, really love raised beds is because I find I can plant more intensively. You're not walking on the soil. You don't have to create rows. Everything can be planted much closer together because there's no soil compaction and you're not needing space for humans to walk around in. So therefore, on a seed packet where it says distance between seeds versus distance between rows, you can just plant your stuff that distance between seeds. I find that I can get almost twice as much produce out of a 4x4 raised garden bed as I could out of a long row of the same types of plants. Another reason is weeding. Oh my goodness, far less weeding involved, especially if you keep those raised beds mulched well, because it's not as easy for those invasive weeds to get in there, especially if you plant intensively. I find raised beds also easier to amend. Middle-aged lady here, and the difference between having to dig down deep or dig down at something that's slightly raised up to help me definitely makes a difference. Also, the bed itself, the edges are a great place to, if you want to sit and weed, you can do that with much more easily with a raised bed than you can straight on the ground. Created other videos about why raised beds, and I know other people too. So the rest of this video is going on the assumption that you want to do a raised bed. So here are some things you should consider when you're planning that out. If you're either redoing a garden area or starting from scratch, it seems like a lot of people are doing that this year because I'm getting lots of questions about it. I like to keep my soil nourished in my raised beds using what I call the 3 C's. And those 3 C's are crop rotation, companion planting, and compost. My little brain is always thinking about these things when I'm out there in the garden and when I'm planting a new area. First off, crop rotation. Why do you want to do that? Well, there are so many reasons to do crop rotation, but the number one reason is different plants use different nutrients. So if you continue to plant the same plant over and over and over again in the same spot, you are going to completely deplete the soil in that spot of a specific nutrient. And another thing that's going to happen is you're going to have the same kind of pests coming and returning. They will lay their eggs in that soil and wake up and find their favorite food sitting there. Okay, so when you do crop rotation, what you're doing is you are ensuring that you're going to be putting different nutrients in the soil, because some crops actually put good stuff into the soil as well as take things out. So if you keep the crop rotation going in a 4-year cycle, I know sometimes that's not possible, sometimes you're looking at 3, but a 4-year cycle is ideal of rotating your various major crops. you are going to find that your soil is going to become less depleted. Okay, so for myself, the crop rotation that I've used on my homestead here for the last 10 years, I go nightshades, brassicas, leafy greens, and legumes. All right, those are the 4 main crops that I rotate through. And there's lots and lots of information about what each of those things are, but just as a basic, nightshades are things like potatoes, eggplants, tomatoes. All right, that's one thing. Those are all heavy feeders that like to take the same things out of the soil. Then we have legumes. So those are your wonderful things like your beans and your peas and your lentils. The legumes take different things out of the soil and also add different things to the soil than your nightshades do. Then we have your leafy greens. I don't think I have to explain what that is. You probably have that one figured out. And brassicas are the other main bed that I do, which is your stuff like your cauliflower, your broccoli, your kale, your cabbage. Those are brassicas. Kohlrabi, that takes and adds different things as well. All right, so with that 4 crop rotation, it's a good idea to set up your raised beds in sets of 4. That makes sense, right? So what I have in my garden is I have my garden set up in 4 rows of raised beds. And these beds in my garden, I make sure that I move every year so that I'm going to do those things like keep the soil nourished and confuse those pests. All right. Now, another thing that's going to really help with that is the companion planting. When I say legumes, for instance, I'm not just planting beans in a bed. What I'm doing is companion planting with other things that are growing in and around with my beans. The beans is the main crop. That's what I'll plant most intensively. But at the same time, I'm going to use the 3 sisters growing method, put some sunflowers and a couple of squash in there as well. And those 3 plants work really well together. There's all sorts of companion plants that you can investigate, and I've done whole other videos about that, but just something to keep in mind. Another reason to do companion planting is I find that every year some crop for some reason will just not grow as well. And if you have done monoculture and you've only planted that 1 crop in a bed, that whole bed becomes a bit of a bust. But if you've companion planted and you've got 2 other crops growing in there intensively with it, it's not a complete bust. You still have something to harvest from that bed. So I really love companion planting. It's something that we do here on the homestead every year. And I promise you, as I'm planting out the beds this year, I will show various companion plants that I use together to help you out if that's something you're interested in. So we've covered crop rotation and we've covered companion planting. Last of all, we have compost. Essential. Okay, this is something that I rely on to help me with my soil nutrition. I don't add any fertilizer to my soil per se. What I do is I compost. I have chickens and I have ducks and I have rabbits. I'm very fortunate, so I can really make that compost very, very rich. But even if you just are using your kitchen scraps and your cuttings from the yard, you can create a pretty healthy compost pile that's going to help you amend that soil and help keep it healthy and nutritious. So that in mind, when you're planning out your garden, you want to make sure that that compost pile is somewhere close to your garden. You will end up not using it very much if it's far from the house and far from where you want to be using it in the garden. My main compost pile is exactly halfway between the chicken coop and the garden for a reason, and I'm very grateful that I put it there. In terms of placing your garden, you probably want to choose one of the sunnier spots that you can. I know that some people have small backyards, so you're not maybe going to have as much choice as some other people do, but try to get yourself an area where there's a lot of sun. So the reason for this is even if you are planting some shade-loving plants, you can use companion plants to provide that shade, and those companion plants will probably like the sun. It's always good to choose a sunny location. Remember how I talked about the wind today? Try to find some shelter. I spend almost as much time building fences around my garden and adding, when I add to the garden, I always add more fencing, because the wind can be a serious detriment to your garden. Now, the wind isn't just about knocking plants over and causing damage from that force. Wind also means you have to water more, because when you have a high wind going, your evaporation off of your soil happens a lot quicker, especially in the heat of the summer. So having some nice shelter from the wind is super, super helpful. Another thing you want to do is, speaking of water, you want to have your garden close to your water source. If you only have one faucet head coming out of your house, you probably want to have your garden somewhere close to that. Otherwise, you're going to be spending a fortune on hoses and you're going to be tripping over a ton of hoses. If you're intending to collect rainwater, try to have that so that it's at a reasonable distance from your garden, because that will become very taxing to you if you have to travel long distances or cart water over from a rain barrel that's on the other side of your property. It's just some little things to consider. Now, in terms of sizing of the beds themselves, for a raised bed, I have really found over the years, and I've played with lots of different sizes, the 4x4 raised bed is really what I consider to be ideal. A 4x4 bed is very easy to reach into the middle from every side. When I first moved out here to the acreage, I thought, oh, I have all this space, I'm going to build huge beds. And I built very, very large, long beds, and a few things happened. It was a real pain in the butt to try to get into the middle of those beds to amend, and honestly, they didn't get harvested as well as they should have because of that. B, I found that the wood actually rotted a lot faster. Those long beams, they start to bow out. Even if you do put supports, I find that the 4x4 size, they have lasted longer than my longer beds. I wanted to replace those longer beds quite soon in the game because they weren't convenient to work, and ironically, they started rotting a heck of a lot faster than my 4x4 beds. I still have a lot of my original 4x4 beds that I built the first year, whereas I've had to replace all of the 4x8, 4x10 beds I made. So just something I've noticed, that 4x4 is a good size. A lot of trellises that you can purchase or upcycle are that size as well, so that's helpful. And if you look back on some of my past videos, you can see that those 4x4s are really easy to work. In terms of sizing, it can be very expensive to fill a raised bed, so you might be tempted to keep them low because it's a lot of money to fill those with soil. That being said, the more you can afford to fill, the better. A 12-inch bed is great. If you can afford to build yourself some nice 12-inch high beds, those are going to be really wonderful for you. I have lots of beds myself, though, that I've built with 10-inch because I just didn't have the cash to shell out and build these huge beds. And that's understandable, but it's sort of one of those things that try to go as much as you can afford. I do recommend going with a bulk source. You can go and get truckloads from a local bulk supplier or have delivery even. It's still going to cost far less when you're talking about large beds like that, 4x4 at a foot high. That's a heck of a lot of soil. It would be extremely expensive to fill that with purchased soil in bags. And last of all, another thing that's super critical that you might think of as a waste of good real estate is planning for your pathways. One of the reasons why we're doing the raised beds is because we want to be able to plant intensively and because we want to reduce our weeding. But if you make it so that you can't move in between your beds and you can't move a wheelbarrow in between your beds, and if you just leave those pathways with grass, guess what's going to encroach into your raised beds? When I'm planning out a new garden for someone, I always really push for having 2.5 feet of approximately in between each bed. We put down something as a weed barrier. I'm a big fan of reusing my old feed bags, and we put mulch on top of that, like wood chips or something. Because it's just as important to stop those weeds from moving into your bed and having a good way of moving around. And just over the years, I've really started to focus a lot more on that, and I've been a lot happier about it. Now, if you are thinking of planting a new garden here in spring, you could be doing something right now to make your work a little bit easier when it is time to start building your new garden. Put down a few layers of cardboard and weigh that down and keep it so the wind won't blow it away. If you do that, you're going to be saving yourself a lot of time and effort when it comes to having to cut sod, because you won't have to do it. The sod will be dead. You do have to have several layers of cardboard though, and you're not going to be able to get away with one, especially in an area like here where we have really, really good, strong long root prairie grasses. If you do a little pre-planning now, you certainly can reduce your work a little ways down the road when it's time to build a new garden. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. I know that was a heck of a lot of stuff to cover, but I just wanted to get you guys thinking about some of these things. I will be doing lots of more videos about seed starting soon because it's almost winter sowing season here in the prairies. And I'm also will be posting videos of every step of the way if that's something that you're interested in seeing and wondering which plants grow really well together. We'll be covering all that this spring. So please stay tuned and please do ask me questions because I do love to be able to create this content that's helpful to you. And as always, I hope you'll take this chance to grow together today. Have a good one.